Here's the pitch: 36,000 years of Forgotten Realms history, gods, wars, dragons, the rise and fall of empires, cataclysms, and the kind of betrayals that dash my faintest hopes that someday WotC remembers the dark sunsetting still exists. And we're doing it all in under an hour. Is it possible? I mean, honestly, my lore OCD screams no way. But hey, you clicked and I'm talking, so I guess we're gonna find out together, aren't we? But here's the thing. Understanding Realms lore is kind of like trying to explain a D&D campaign to your grandma. I mean, it starts out simple enough. Once upon a time, lizard wizards ran the realm. But 10 minutes later, you're neck deep explaining why some spell-casting sandworms nuked Netheril's farmland, while a bunch of backwater hedge wizards built floating cities, which then fell from the sky, because some power-hungry mage wanted to steal godhood. In doing so, he crashed the arcane internet, which made the goddess of magic sacrifice herself, and now you can never cast 10th level fireballs. Thanks a lot, Karsus. So in the immortal words of Gale, the Wizard of Waterdeep, is this safe? Absolutely not. But hey, let's do it anyway. Enough foreplay. Grab your D20s and buckle up. We're diving deep into the birth of the planet, where it all began with more primordial ooze than a Baldur's Gate sewer. We have over 36 millennia ahead of us, with 4 retcons before we even hit the Crown Wars, and at least one addition most of us agreed to pretend never happened. Let's go. To start our journey, we must travel back to the Age of Ages, a time long before your biggest problem was a mind flayer tadpole rewiring your frontal lobe. This was prehistory. No dungeons, no dragons. Only the overgod Ao. Less a god to be worshipped, more an immortal game master setting up his house rules. Ao would conceive of a universe, and within it, the crystal sphere where realm space would reside. At its heart, a lone world would orbit a single star. This planet, a celestial snow globe, would be called a Betrayal. The overgod Ao is often thought of as indifferent or capricious, for reasons that will become clearer as we advance this timeline. However, it was his singular act of creation from which the very genesis of every story, every hero, every villain and empire to come would be made possible. From the quiet of this nascent reality, Ao then brought forth the first beings of divine power, the twin sister goddesses Selûne and Shar. This was followed by setting the Great Wheel in motion, the cosmological architecture required for existence. This would encompass the literal heavens, hells, and every temperament in between, each snapping into alignment as the outer planes. A consequence of the balance struck between law, chaos, good and evil, each plane would ultimately reflect the influences of the myriad of gods to follow. This fundamental framework would also include the inner planes and their infinite supply of raw materials, fire, water, earth and air, along with all of their adjacent para and quasi-elemental planes. Completing this mosaic were the planes of ethereal energies, both positive and negative, and in time the 2 great mirrors to come, the Feywild and the Shadowfell, or the Land of the Fairy and Plane of Shadow for the more classically inclined. The game board was now set, the pieces in place. All that was missing were the first sparks of life. But then came the drama. Diametrically opposed forces of light and dark, the twin goddesses would set the standard for sibling rivalry. Selûne, the brilliant light of creation, Shar, the voice of absolute darkness. Their duality was one of perfect yet opposing balance. But balance is not peace. Yet from their fleeting cooperation, a third deity of this newborn universe would be introduced, Shantia, the Earth Mother who embodied the waiting potential of the fertile blue planet below. And it was Shantia who first yearned to see a Betrayal blossom with life. Selûne agreed. She too wanted to nurture the budding world, to ignite the stars. But her dark twin Shar, who saw life as a fleeting, painful flicker that only marred a perfect darkness, objected. Photosynthesis needs sunlight, and Shar was busy trying to pull the plug. And so the cosmic custody battle had begun. The result of their conflict was 2 injured sisters, some deeply seated animus, and probably a bit of personal trauma, but lunar victory for life was had. Shar would slink into the shadows of nihilism, where she eternally plots her revenge to this very day. From the celestial cuts of sibling conflict bled new deities and their domains of influence. As this young pantheon of gods began to shape the nascent world in their image, those first sparks of divine order would awaken elemental intelligences that later 4th edition scholars would call the primordials. These powers would also assert their claim on the new planet, thus setting the theater for a pivotal war to come. Long before names or nations, calendars or timelines, divine purpose and elemental instinct would collide for ownership of a still-forming planet. The gods wanted order. The primordials, however, had other ideas. The raw, untamed essence of the planet rose like elemental antibodies to attack the divine interference they saw as an infection of the natural state. And just like that, the Dawn War was ignited. In a time before time, upon a world with no life means no mortal eyes or hands to record the epic events to follow. Yet the tales are plenty, some more apocryphal than others, but each with the most obscure of origins. So it should come as no surprise to learn that no history book recalls who cracked the sky or threw the first mountain, only that two factions, each with planet-sized egos, bloomed into the very first divine war. No writings are needed, however, when the scars of that war are so plainly visible in every mountain range, every ocean and sea, every rolling canyon and coastline. In that historic silence, they flattened ridgelines, boiled seas, and punched calderas of magma into the Earth's crust. Gods hurling divinity against the primal power of elemental guardians of storm, fire, and stone, unfolding over a world locked beneath a planetary shell of ice. It would be circa negative 35,000 Dale reckoning when that shell first cracked and buckled. Icy continental shells crashed into what would become an embryonic ocean, the meltwater sculpting valleys in days that future rivers would spend ages polishing. The great glaciers of prehistory and the Blue Age soon unveiled the supercontinent of Meroboros, a single landmass so wide you could march for months in any direction and never see shoreline. The heavens still roared overhead, the war had not ended, but the gods and elemental lords, distracted by their own hubris and this grand feud, scarcely noticed the change. Yet with the battlefield landscape shifting, the planet could finally foster complex life. Seeds trapped for eons awoke, spores colonized newborn soil, and the first true forest clawed upward through earth, ice, and ash. Each a nucleus of life, ushering in the days of thunder. 5,000 years of rubbing is racing, at least for no less than 3 emergent species, each seeking to claim their dominance upon this new world. As this chapter draws to a close and we move into an era of Genesis, it's reasonable to ask, has the Dawn War come to an end? Not even close. The chronologies and timelines of Realms lore care not for the clean chapter desires of its authors, and history's demarcation of beginnings and ends are never so accommodating. We tend to think of war as an interruption, a violent but temporary break from a normal state of peace, a storm that soon passes. The Dawn War, however, was no such minor interruption. It was an era of countless, continual conflicts. Allow me to get meta for a moment. Imagine World War I, which lasted a shade over 4 years, and World War II, which lasted 6. 2 world wars from the real, totaling a single decade. Yet our modern world is shaped by its influence, our libraries filled with innumerable heroic stories, shameful atrocities, and infinite tragedies that will never be forgotten. To put the Dawn War in proper context, take that decade of World War horrors and stack it end to end 500 times, unending and mostly unrelenting. That's the Dawn War. Not a decade of battle, but 5,000 years of war. From the first Sumerian armies clashing over irrigation ditches, pharaonic wars over the River Nile, the fall of Rome, the Napoleonic and American Civil Wars, right up to 21st century drone strikes, all of humanity's wars and conflicts comfortably fit inside the timeline of the Dawn War, with centuries of room to spare. This is our frame of reference, and one often missed in the study of Realms lore history. The Days of Thunder didn't follow the Dawn War, they unfolded inside of it. Its influence serving as the soundtrack for the birth of the world's first civilizations and their desperate struggles for dominance in the age to come. With the cosmic framework of life now in place and divine blood of the Dawn War still dripping from the stars, the stage was finally set for mortal life to stumble into relevance. Upon a vast, unclaimed world still ravaged by the chaos of war crawled the first 3 species of notable mortals. Welcome to the Days of Thunder. Meroboros is the chessboard upon which all life is placed. And without its seas or oceans carving into and dividing the lands to create natural defensive borders, this early realm more resembled a giant planetary mosh pit than a cradle of life. Some pedantic scholars will argue the technicality of the first mortal races actually numbering 4 or even 5. However, the elves proper would not migrate to this world for a few thousand more years. And the humans? Well, yes, they almost certainly existed, but were narratively irrelevant. Our namesake species in this age made the Flintstones look like the Jetsons, mostly naked, living in caves and barely grasping the concept and certainly not the use of even the simplest tools. At this stage of our timeline, the ancestors of all within the range of my voice were still awaiting their ascension to a Stone Age. Our time will come, but for now the true powers of this young realm belong to the first 3 creator races. The Saruk, also known as Saurians, were a reptilian race widely accepted as the first of the creator races. These hyper-intelligent beings I have grown fond of calling lizard wizards at my table were the progenitors to the modern-day reptilian and serpentine races of lizard folk, Naga, and the insidious Yuan-Ti. The Saruk established early dominance through a sprawling empire. Among its many notable realms included Okoth to the south in the region of modern-day Mulharan, Mahershal, established on the Chultan Peninsula to the far west, and then cutting inland across what we today call the Sword Coast, the Saruk established Isostefafil in present-day Anauroch. Their blistering expansion quickly made them the largest empire of ancient Faerûn within a single century. However, their dominance would fade, a downfall many historians link to the fracturing of their god, the World Serpent, and their continually increasing over-reliance on the ambitious Yuan-Ti. However, what makes the Saruk the most historic of the creator races is not that they were the first, but their role in arguably one of the most significant discoveries unearthed from this early age, or perhaps any other. The Saruk were the founders of a secretive order of arcanists called the Beateth. These ancient serpentine scholars and sages specialized in the study and organization of the planet's earliest magic, unraveling never-before-known secrets and codifying their collective research and knowledge. Operating from archive strongholds such as the Hall of Mist, the Beateth membership would evolve to include each of the creator races of this era, incorporating the findings, experiments, and understandings from each to advance the arcane arts. While the Beateth almost certainly made many remarkable yet unknown breakthroughs now lost to time, their most significant legacy was the creation of a magical compendia ancient historians would call the Golden Skins of the World Serpent, and modern-day sages would designate as the Nether Scrolls. This set of enchanted scrolls made from precious metals were encoded with discoveries and theories that would form the foundation of magic on Netheril, influencing virtually all subsequent magical knowledge. The scrolls were unique in that repeated study by those of later sages revealed deeper, ever-expanding magical insights, making them invaluable for arcane study. Noted for their many cycles of loss and rediscovery, it would be the Netherese humans who would find the Nether Scrolls around -3533 Dale Reckoning that would form one of the most enduring histories to be written in the Chronicles of Realms lore that we will discuss a bit later. Unfortunately, today many of the scrolls have once again become lost or scattered across Netheril. Some are even said to have fallen into the hands of evil, such as the Shadow Lich King, Larlock. Yet, despite these historic contributions, by -34,100 Dale Reckoning, the Saruk would go the way of the dinosaur. As the Saruk withdrew from active rule, they increasingly relied upon their servitor races, especially the intelligent and ambitious Yuan-Ti. Designed to be clever administrators and overseers, the Yuan-Ti gradually assumed much of the day-to-day rule of Saruk society. Eventually, the Yuan-Ti shifted their own loyalties from their Saruk creators to their own serpent gods, leading to widespread defection and uprisings, warfare, and an erosion of Saruk power. Ultimately, the Yuan-Ti seizing control and consigning the once mighty Saruk to obscurity. A collapsed empire serving as a perfect, if ironic, example of a civilization undone by complacency and the ambition of their own creations. Evolving from the primitive seas approximately 6 centuries later, in circa -33,500, the amphibious Batraki would find prominence in the shadow of Saruk ruins. Ancestors to the Bullywugs, Kuatoa, and Doppelgangers, among others, the Batraki would build civilizations in the sweltering marshes and fetid swamps of the Young Realm. If the collapse of the Faerûn can be attributed to complacency, the Batraki fall might best be summarized as a series of terrible decisions, starting with picking a fight with literal titans and ending by releasing an imprisoned primordial who would literally fracture the planet. Beginning around -31,000 during the final millennia of these Days of Thunder, and just about the time the Dawn War was losing some steam, the Batraki, on the wrong end of a very lopsided war, made a final, fatal error. In desperation, they shattered the prisons of several primordials in a bid to snatch victory from the jaws of titanic defeat, unleashing the very elemental enemies the gods had waged a millennia-spanning and ongoing war to contain. One of the freed primordials, a draconic entity known as Asgaroth the World Shaper, celebrated its get-out-of-jail-free card by bringing down a massive ice comet to collide with the planet. In what can only be described as a true what-did-you-actually-think would happen moment, this ill-advised act would not only fail to alter the course of war, it would categorically end the existence of the Batraki Empire and leave forever the scars of their hubris upon the world map. The resulting extinction-level event scholars would call the Tearfall, and in its wake entire empires were erased in fire and flood. The impact site would form the Sea of Fallen Stars, and the supercontinent of Meroboros would be shattered into the more familiar continents we know today. The residual climate collapse to follow would swiftly end Batraki civilization. A few survivors fled into the darkest swamps or retreated to the Plain of Limbo, where some became or were confused with the Slade, depending upon your chosen lore. Regardless, their once mighty kingdoms crumbled, leaving only scattered ruins and the legacy of the races they created. The planet, now on the brink of annihilation by both the Tearfall fallout and a renewed Dawn War, was finally enough to see the overgod Ao rise from his celestial couch to lift a godly finger and hit the divine reset. In doing so, Ao would split Abir Torel, forming two distinct worlds, Toril for the gods and its twin Abir for the primordials. There are canonical writings that will call this event some variation of the Sundering or the First Sundering. However, approximately 14,000 years from this moment in time, the elves will perform their own high magic version of realm landscaping to bring forth the elven island of Evermeet. And instead of using some creativity to pick a new label for this event, their historians will call this the First Sundering, confusing sages, scholars, and lore nerds such as myself for the next decade. So to save us all from that headache, let's just call this a divine division, a celestial mitosis, or simply that time when Ao cleaved the world in two. Nonetheless, in the aftermath of the split, the last defiant primordials that remained on Toril were finally defeated or imprisoned. And there are select texts found in the 4th edition libraries that will tell us this Dawn War triumph was enabled by a primordial betrayal among their own, even naming the defector, Ubtao the Deceiver, a title earned for his alliance with the gods that 4E insists ensured a planetary victory. Although as a point of clarification, I am obligated to point out that this story is a full 4E retcon of Ubtao, as are all the primordials, holding limited support outside of the 4th edition. In fact, Ubtao held the divine status of a deity long before the 4E writings, existing as the god who created the jungle region of Chult and founded the city of Mesro as early as the 2nd edition. So to call him a primordial, or worse, a deceiver with clear contradictory evidence, smells of more self-serving 4E propaganda. I will, however, leave the merits of such condemnation up to each of you. With the planetary divorce now finalized, our third and final of this era's creator races would see their own rise and fall. The Avian Aerie flourished after the fall of the Batraki, reaching their peak circa -30,700. Masters of wind and majestic sky enclaves such as Vayaku, the Aerie soared above the burgeoning realms as the earliest progenitors of the Aarakocra, Kinku, and other avian races. In an all-too-familiar telling, their kingdoms would fall prey to internal strife, devastating losses in conflicts with rivals such as the Lamassu and the Knoll Shamans of Yinogu, along with an epidemic known as the Wasting Plague sweeping across their civilization. The final blow would come dramatically, circa -30,000 Dale Reckoning, with the rise of Dragonkind. Eager to assert their dominance, dragons, both metallic and chromatic, united in what is known as the First Flight of Dragons, coordinated a purge of the skies, led by the dragon general, Nagamat. In a series of apocalyptic battles, each and every Aerie sky realm was conquered or burned to the ground below, their once vast empires consumed by dragonfire. The lore hints that the few surviving Aerie migrated west to distant lands such as Mastika and Ankarome to become a footnote in realms lore. The downfall of the Aerie would mark the final chapter of the creator races. Fallen but not forgotten, each empire made significant contributions upon the era, from establishing the foundation of magic that would eventually come to be called the Weave, to creating the ancestral bloodline of over a dozen species that today call the realms home. However, as these days of thunder came to a close, winged shadows over their ruins would soon foreshadow a new age, the time of dragons. The first 5 millennia of life on this young world would see the birth, rise, and fall of the Saruk, the Batraki, and the Aerie, each holding title as the dominant empire of their time. As a new millennia turned, each of these creator races would leave only scars and trace remnants of that dominance upon the surface of Toril. However, rising from their ruin, 2 new powers would exert their influence upon the realms, a united dragonkind and the giant realm of Astoria. The giants, children of Anam the Allfather, had already established themselves as self-appointed overlords during the closing days of the Dawn Wars. Meanwhile, the dragons, convinced that anything not currently on fire probably should be, established their first great empires of impossible draconic naming conventions. Argis Thiliax claimed vast swaths of what would become the northern reaches, while Kaysen Malsevere dominated the eastern territories. Darastrive Rythika carved out southern domains, and Tharkrix Gonatix established dominion over the western lands. But the unity that allowed dragonkind to spread so far, so fast, would not last. The conflict historians would call the Draco Holy Wars erupted circa -30,000, as theological disputes among the deeply devout dragons of this age finally reached a boiling point. Unlike the solitary secular dragons of modern times, these ancient dragons were fanatical followers of a myriad of different draconic deities and dogmas, and therein lie the problem. Every dragon species of this age believed their particular deity and doctrine represented the pinnacle of draconic perfection. Gold dragons would claim that Asgaroth the World Shaper was clearly a lawful good gold dragon. While silver dragons often grudgingly accepted this notion, red dragons would become incensed at such absurdities, insisting Asgaroth was obviously an evil-aligned red dragon, and further that the metallic factions had lost their collective minds. The resulting wars nearly drove the entire dragon race to extinction. It would be the Dragonfall War of -29,500 that would become the climactic closing chapter that defined the wider Draco Holy Wars. As nearly 5 centuries of religious and philosophical conflict eroded the solidarity of dragonkind, draconic factions fell to rivalry, with each variant aligning to either the metallic or chromatic sects of Bahamut and Tiamat respectively. The growing animus would become eternally bound when followers of Zymor, later revealed to be Bahamut in disguise, killed Nagamut, the powerful chromatic general who led the first flight of dragons and loyally served the darker interests of Tiamat. What started as political assassination soon escalated into full-scale warfare between the emerging factions of what would be the dividing line of draconic good and evil. Tiamat, not to be outdone by her sibling rival, unleashed her spawn of Tiamat, abominations designed to tip the scales of war. Bahamut's response was characteristically methodical, creating the first Dragonborn, humanoid draconic knights, servants imbued with an unshakable sense of moral superiority. While the great dragon empire suffered from internal strife, the now fractured unity of all of dragonkind still had to share realm dominance with the rapidly expanding territories and influence of the giant kingdom of Astoria, a nation of titans who increasingly saw themselves as the sole dominant power of this Dawn Age era. No discussion on the time of dragons or the signature draconic war of this time period can be considered complete until we profile the other major power and opposition to dragon rule in this Dawn Age. And by talking with any scholar who specializes in the origins and history of giants, one will be quickly corrected that this era is, or at least should be, equally known as the Time of Giants. Long before the reigns of elves and men would carve their names into history, much of these early realms were the dominion of giants, despite the dragon-heavy lore offered by the history books. It was called the Colossal Kingdom of Astoria, once the sovereign realm of a race destined to rule, a civilization rooted in divine favor, but doomed by the hubris of gods and the inevitability of betrayal. They were the children of Onum Allfather, a mercurial god and the creator of giant kind. According to 2nd edition lore found in the resource Giantcraft, the Allfather is an ancient god rumored to be the offspring of the primordial forces of law and chaos, although much of his origin is cloudy and incomplete. Some myths say he wandered the multiverse, creating worlds and gods on a whim, which is where the official lore gives him such titles as the progenitor of worlds and the great creator. Yet there exists opposing lore found in the monster mythology text, also from 2nd edition, that posits Anum as a sleeping god, whose dreams create the fundamental substance of reality that other gods then use in their own creations. It is in this alternative lore that Anum is given his most fascinating of titles, the Creator by Thought. Regardless, it is believed he was one of the first handful of gods to come to Abir-Torel, arriving sometime prior to -30,000 Dale Reckoning, and soon after siring his first terrestrial sons with the primordial entity and eventual betrayer, Othea, but that is a story for another time. To honor his progeny, Adam forged his kingdom of Astoria, father's seed in the Jotun tongue, as a divine gift. He established the Ordning, a rigid social hierarchy, and the giant pantheon, and partitioned his vast kingdom amongst his many sons, each founding their own dynasty. Storm giants on the seas, cloud giants in the skies, fire giants upon the southern volcanoes, frost giants across the northern tundras, stone giants in the earth's core, and hill giants upon its rolling plains. Under this divine mandate, Astoria thrived, its influence spreading across the realm, reaching its zenith around -28,000 DR, where the borders of the Colossal Kingdom now stretched from the Vilhan Reach in the south to the frozen northern lands entombed by the Great Glacier, and from the savage frontier in the west all the way to the distant cold lands in the east. Cloud giants built majestic cities that drifted on the winds. Fire giants forged metallic metropolises of mithril and adamantine, and the storm giants engineered mighty wonders of mechanical conveyance. The Titans competed for honor in architectural marvels, celestial calendars, and mastery over their domains. Rivalries were marked by contests of skill and craft rather than bloodletting. Astoria seemed unassailable. The Colossal Kingdom had entered its golden age, an era of peace and prosperity, the Time of Giants, until the dragons would make their own claim on these forgotten realms. As a new millennia dawned, circa -26,000 DR, with the question of who would control this realm, dragons or giants, still left unanswered, an avatar of the dragon fire god Garrux decided to settle the matter. With a flight of red dragons behind him, Garrux led a devastating assault on a cloud giant city. This act of winged arson enraging the giants into all-out war. The 1,000-year war had begun. For the next millennium, dragons and giants turned Toril into their personal Thunderdome. The highlight of the war for most lore masters is found in the giants' creation of colossal constructs called the Vanandad, or Titan of Death in Jotun. Essentially a dragon-slaying mech eclipsing 80 feet tall and carrying a great sword that would make Zariel's fortress blush. Dragons, meanwhile, responded by doing what dragons do best, burning everything that wasn't already on fire, at least the red ones. The lore tells us the war ended 1,000 years later, right on the dot in -25,000, which in my expert opinion is perhaps why it's called the 1,000-Year War. In what was anticlimactic for both sides, the end came not through a decisive victory but mutual exhaustion. Both sides had bled themselves pale. Astoria, once stretching from the cold lands of the Vilhan Reach, now occupied only the frozen northern wastes. The Dragon Kingdoms fared no better as their empires lay in similar ruin, and even worse, the unity that propelled them to realm dominance in the first place was now forever fractured. Over time, draconic philosophers across all factions came to the conclusion that gods who encouraged such wasteful, fratricidal warfare were no longer worthy of their worship. This realization, combined with their near extinction from the Thousand-Year War, led the vast majority of the now fractured alliance of dragons to abandon religion entirely. This distaste for the mechanics of organized war going so far as to develop a strategic war game designed to replace such large-scale battles. The game was called Zorvental, and while it is often written to exist as a more complex analog to chess, the truth is the concepts and rules of Zorvental lay beyond the comprehension of most humans. Unfortunately, despite their invention of a draconic version of Risk, the damage was already done. The age of unified dragon empires was over, and the stage was set for smaller, hungrier powers to claim their place in the sun. Dragon unity had vanished, their empires a distant memory, and the now solitary dragons of the realms licking their wounds from the Thousand-Year War. No one would argue this was a rough millennia for dragonkind, but their troubles were far from over. It was circa negative 25,000 Dale reckoning when a crimson comet streaked across the Faerûnian sky, and all hell broke loose. Enter the King-Killer Star. Star, comet, or celestial object if you prefer. Whatever its form, the appearance of the red-tailed harbinger of madness punched all of dragonkind directly in the frontal lobe, triggering the Draco Rage, a magical psychosis filling the dragon's mind with insatiable bloodlust and transforming each into a rampaging murder machine. Good, evil, metallic, or chromatic, no dragon was spared, zero discrimination. The minds of even the most genius of their species now reduced to the most primal instinct of a savage apex predator. There was no control, just frothing mauls, elemental breath weapons, and lots of screaming. And it was here that the elves enter the Faerûnian history books. Recent migrants to the realm themselves found opportunity to make their first big move, leveraging this draconic vulnerability into strategic brilliance. It would be circa negative 24,000 when, having already witnessed the devastating effects of the comet's Draco Rage, the elven High Mages would craft an artifact called the Draco Rage Mythal, its effects designed to undermine and restrict draconic dominance. But the genius would be found in its targeting. The Mythal didn't prevent the rage, it made it predictable and geographically amplified. Every time the King-Killer Star returned, the magical field, spanning roughly 250,000 square miles, would activate across all of Faerûn. Dragons caught within this zone faced an inevitable choice: flee the area or succumb to the frenzied rage and bloodlust psychosis that would turn them against their own kind. The strategic impact was devastating. No longer could dragons maintain unified territories or coordinated armies when periodic cosmic events forced mass migrations or fratricide. The Mythal effectively shattered draconic civilization, enabling elves and other humanoid races to displace dragonkind as the dominant power of the realms. The Draco Rage Mythal continued to harass dragons for millennia to come until its destruction in 1373 Dale Reckoning. Still, its legacy is undeniable. After untold cycles of carnage, the elven artifact has left a forever mark in dragon-elven relations, one that is still witnessed today. One of the more fascinating and obscure lore facets related to the dragon histories of the Dawn Age is actually found in the storied tales of the Stout Folk, and starts with a tradition known as the Dragon Moot, a ritual custom of courage that firmly holds heroic status in dwarven lore and is well documented in the 3rd edition text found in the Dragons of Faerun resource. This proud ritual of ceremonial hunt has seen its use wane in the modern era, but its glories evoking the era of dwarven fortitude and communal spirit can still be heard in story and song as dwarves empty their ale tankards. Similar to a medieval form of NATO, dragon moots were called only in the gravest of circumstance, whenever a dragon emerged in a region and offered too great a threat to be left alone any longer, yet was too powerful for a clan to risk tackling alone. The draconic risk posed by such powerful creatures was ample reason for even the most proud, insular, or even fractured clans to put aside their grievances in order to join together against a common enemy. The need for unity in the face of a dragon was well understood among all in dwarven culture, each understanding that no single clan would lightly choose to confront an ancient worm on its own, risking devastation or even annihilation of their home and kin. The call for a dragon moot was undertaken by messenger dwarves who would travel from hold to share the news of a dragon's presence and invite others to join in on the hunt. Those answering the call would marshal their most tested warriors to lead the attack, its ranks filled with the frightened strength of young dwarves wanting to prove themselves worthy, those skilled in the arts of magic and bolstered by the axes of storied veterans seeking one last chance at glory and a desire to die a good death in battle. The gathering itself was as much diplomatic assembly as any call to battle. Great feasts were held, trade agreements were made, and alliances grew stronger. The lore even offers that the occasional negotiation of marriage contracts between clans were not uncommon, each ceremony an expected custom of a dragon moot. The inclusion of these rituals really reflecting the dwarven reverence for tradition, as well as highlighting the importance of building bonded relations and fostering a unified posture, even in the face of a political dispute or a rival clan. All dragon moot decisions were arrived at by consensus. The leaders of each clan debated strategy and tactics, discussed risks, and of course the conflict rewards, namely how the horde of slain dragons would be divided. While this assumption of victory may reflect as both bad karma and stubborn arrogance, the histories do confirm that these coordinated dragon moots, more often than not, ended in dwarven triumph. The lore tells us the battles that followed were a true test of dwarven unity and courage as warriors faced off against dragons whose depredations could lay waste to an entire mountain. Success in a dragon moot became the stuff of legend, its tale retold through generations as a touchstone of dwarven heroism and their proud bloodline. However, even as the dwarves honored this tradition, it gradually faded from common practice over the coming centuries. Declining populations from other conflicts, specifically with the dark elf Drow, meant fewer warriors to spare for such rituals. As time moved into the more modern eras, dragon moots were mostly remembered in story and song, carried out only rarely when circumstances were truly dire. Still, through victories and losses, the legacy of the dragon moot remains as a strong tribute to valor and the enduring bonds of dwarven kinship found in the face of communal adversity. Power breeds pride, and pride sows the seeds of ruin. This elven proverb is most fitting for one of the most expansive eras in the realm's lore timeline that spanned the 12,000 years that followed in the wake of those ancient draconic and giant conflicts. Having begun their migration to Netheril from the realm of the Feywild, or Plane of the Fairy if you prefer, circa -27,000 Dale Reckoning, the elven people would assert their presence in this period, that history would call the First Flowering. Marked by the ascendancy of their variant races, this age saw the elves of Faerûn establish unparalleled cultural, magical, and political dominance, founding many notable and influential realms such as Eravandar, Illifarn, Keltomir, Myaratar, and Chantel Othrair, among others. Along with the rise of elven nations, this era would also be noteworthy for first recording the departure of the Avariel, winged elves from eras past who, technically speaking, were the first elven blood to call Netheril home. The lore suggests the Avariel retreated back to the Feywild as their land-dwelling cousins soon became a dominant cultural force. However, the most significant pages of elven chronicles marked by the First Flowering would be found in the divine conjuration of Evermeet. In response to prophecies and threats, along with the desire to create an untouchable homeland, elven mages enacted a mighty ritual of high magic in -17,600. Their goal? To bring forth the elven island paradise of Evermeet, a sanctuary for their people. While the ritual did succeed, the arcane backlash upon the realms was devastating, further fracturing continents and sinking vast landmasses. It should be noted here that this first elven sundering, as an historical label and not the event itself, has at times been conflated with the prehistoric splitting of a Bir Torel that I have previously covered. So if you have ever found yourself asking, hey, wasn't there a first sundering back when Ao divided the world at the end of the Dawn War? Well, take solace in knowing you're not alone. As a 4th edition lore construct, its connections are fraught with many leaps in logic. From an in-universe perspective, we can just chalk this up to elven historians never missing an opportunity to write their names into history, a classic bit of elven self-importance. Nonetheless, as the elven kingdoms flourished, another race also began its own slow, steady, subterranean rise. The chronicles covering the dwarves' first appearance upon the realms is often contradictory. We have lore that posits dwarves being enslaved by the giants of Astoria as far back as negative 25,000. Yet other canonical timelines state that the earliest dwarven settlements appear much later, said to have migrated from the Jhaamdath mountains of Karatur bordering both Faerûn and Zakara around negative 16,000. One potential path of reconciling this conflicting ancestry is to position these earlier proto-dwarves in much the same way we might classify the Avariel elves, establishing their earliest lineage by tracing the dwarven bloodline to those ancient eras. While I think it's safe to say that dwarves were indeed enslaved by the giants in that distant past, the rise of widely recognized dwarven cultures and kingdoms would not stake its claim upon the realm's landscape until circa negative 15,000, well after the Colossal Kingdom's fall. The details are admittedly as muddled as a tavern brawl over the last flagon of ale, but the core truth is simple and dwarvenly stubborn. The stout folk were here. They endured much hardship, a common theme of dwarven kind, just ask the Duergar. And from the Jhaamdath mountains they would migrate west to carve out the first of their great empires. In the south, the Gold Dwarves would establish the glorious underground rift city of Beharenden, beneath what modern geographies and maps call the Shar. However, its story is one of despair, ending in a prolonged siege and eventual conquest by the Drow, occurring around negative 9,000 to become the infamous first Drow capital of Talantawar. This single event cementing the eternal, bitter hatred between dwarves and Drow that exists to this very day. The first flowering was an era of elven growth and dwarven awakenings. However, in time, rivalries grew between the disparate elven tribes and their realms, setting the stage for future discord. These early skirmishes and divisions, particularly over territory and ideology, would foreshadow the coming Crown Wars. Realms lore history offers more often than not a common trend among the fairy folk, that any age finding elven dominance inevitably also ends in an age highlighted by elven hubris. And so the golden blossoms of the first flowering, an expansive age of elven prosperity, soon withered into the poisonous ivy that was the Crown Wars, a series of 5 brutal periods of elven conflict over a span of 3 millennia, each spilling elven blood, each marked by pride and arrogance, and each leaving a forever stain on the elven bloodline. But to understand the poison that would consume the elven people, we must first look back to distant epochs, long before the elven crowns of their growing empires were ever forged upon Netheril, a time when a first elven betrayal occurred, not upon the mortal lands, but in the heavens themselves, circa negative 30,000 Dale reckoning. Her name was Araushni, goddess of destiny, spinner of elven fates, and consort to the elven high god Corellon Lorethian, and her treason was one of escalating depravity. First, she conspired with the orc god Grumpsh, enchanting Corellon's sword scabbard to make his blade shatter in battle. The plot was foiled only by the vigilance of the elven goddess of night skies and moonlight, Sihanine Moonbow. Undeterred, the sinister-hearted Araushni then goaded Malar, the Beast Lord, into his own assassination attempt, attacking the wounded Corellon upon his return to the elven divine homeland of Arvindor, a second failed attempt. Her third and final betrayal was a complex web of deceit. Araushni gathered a deliberately weak coalition of evil gods to launch a doomed assault on Arvindor, a war designed only to provide cover. Araushni's true plan was to make her innocent daughter, the good-aligned goddess of dance and the hunt, Ilastraii, the unwitting instrument of murder. Mother of the Year, am I right? After imprisoning the suspicious Sihanine Moonbow under the watch of her complicit son Faerun, Araushni ensured that Ilastraii would innocently deliver yet another cursed scabbard to her father Corellon. As planned during the chaos of battle, just as the paper army would break and retreat, the scabbard's magic drew Ilastraii's own arrows directly to her father's chest, nearly killing him. Araushni then moved in for her final tearful act, professing her Oscar-worthy grief and offering Corellon a god-killing poison disguised as a loving sip of healing water. But Seanine, having slipped the watch of Faerûn, arrived to perform a deus ex machina, merging with two other goddesses, Erdri Fania and Hanali Selenil, to form the triune deity Angharat, their combined power saving Corellon at just the last moment. For her unpardonable crimes, Corellon's judgment was swift. He stripped Araushni of elven divinity and cast her into the abyss. There she was reborn as Lolth, the demon queen of spiders, and for millennia she would wait, her hatred unchecked. And it would be in the Crown Wars conflicts 18 millennia later that Lolth would find the perfect kindling for the Spider Queen's long-simmering revenge against her elven kin. We flash forward to negative 12,000 DR to see these conflicts first ignited when the Sun Elf rulers of Aravandar, later called the Vishantar Empire, launched a surprise attack on the realm of Myaratar. This Aravandar aggression would culminate in negative 10,500 as a tragedy that history would label the Dark Disaster and the Killing Storms. In a sinister act of elven high magic and atrocity, the Sun Elves would not only annihilate Myaratar, but taint its lush forest lands into the barren, monster-haunted wastelands, now known as the High Moor. Horrified by what can only be viewed as a genocide, the other elven nations initially united against Aravandar, yet the wars would rage on, growing ever darker. However, it would be during the Fourth Crown War where the landscape of elven heritage would be changed forever. While the destruction of Myaratar stands as a tragic monument to Sun Elf arrogance, it would be the southern Dark Elves of Ilithir who would seal their people's fate as Lolth's influence was revealed. What began as brutal but possibly understandable retribution against Aravandar's allies soon twisted into something more unholy, a sinister crusade. Bolstered by the fiendish power of their new Spider Queen, the Ilithiri unleashed demonic magics of fire and corruption, consuming entire forests and prompting a united condemnation from all elves. These increasingly profane acts, carrying the stench of Lolth's revenge, soon became unforgivable. During the fifth and final Crown War in negative 10,000 DR, a united council of elven nations, backed by the divine might of the head of the Seldarine, cast down the Ilithiri as a people. All of them. In a divine decree that would reverberate across elven history, Corellon cursed them. Their skin turned to obsidian black, their hair to stark white, and they were exiled from the sunlit world forever. This event, known as the Descent of the Drow, drove them into the deep caverns of the Underdark. In those darkened realms, shaped by a shared hatred and devoted to their Tanaree Spider Queen Lolth, the Drow would not only survive their exile, they would thrive, becoming one of the most enduring antagonists in all of Realms lore. After 3 millennia of betrayal, backstabbing, and oppression against their own people, the Crown Wars drew to a close with elven empires each retreating, destroyed, or exiled to the depths below. The era left elven power fractured and broken, with a legacy forever stained by the self-inflicted wounds of shame and tragedy. The resulting power void from these Crown Wars would then await the next civilization in line to try their hand at gaining dominion in these forgotten realms. As the blood-hazed tragedies of the Crown Wars came to a close, the steel grip of control over the realms had loosened, welcoming a new wave of humanoid upstarts to test their fate at realm dominance. The stout folk, driven from their great rift city of Beharendin at the hands of the Drow, delved deep into the mountains of the north and west to carve out the mighty subterranean kingdom of Shanatar, while the elves, weary from 3 millennia of civil war, began the slow process of building a new and isolated forest or migrating to their new island sanctuary of Evermeet, each proving to be fertile soil for new powers to rise. This was the age of humanity, a sprawling epoch where for the first time, emergent human civilizations found the room to breathe, build, and find their own place upon the lands. The first act of this era, often called the Founding Time, spanned roughly 6,000 years, from negative 9,000 to negative 3,000, and is where we find the establishment of 4 great human empires of Faerûn. There are certainly more than just the 4 kingdoms I will profile today. Faerûn's history is littered with the corpses of ambitious and overreaching human empires, so many that we must, for the sake of the ever-growing word count of this treatise, give a few the historical cold shoulder without ignoring them completely. Take the empires of Narfell and Ramathar in the frigid north, one a savage kingdom of demon-binders north and east of the Sea of Fallen Stars, the other an empire of sword and spell-slinging battle wizards from the lands that would later become the nation of Thay and their famed Red Wizards. 2 kingdoms, bitter rivals, and all-out war. In a shocking twist I'm sure no one saw coming, they annihilated each other in a magical apocalypse of sorcery and summoned fiends. Millennia later, the South saw the Shun Imperium enjoy a 400-year highlight reel of necromancy and brutal conquest before it too collapsed under the sheer weight of its own undead villainy. Each of these kingdoms certainly deserve more coverage than the 90 seconds I just gave them, and truth be told, my lore OCD and I fought longer than it would have taken to just write another 10 minutes of history, but the lore must go on. However, if there is a particular empire you'd like to see get equal airtime, be sure to let me know in the comments. Nonetheless, while their stories are worthy cautionary tales, they are but the opening acts for the true stars of humanity, empires whose rise and fall would not just take up chapters in the chronicles of history, but redefine the very realms. The first and oldest of these began far to the east, circa -8350, in the fertile basin of Rauren, where a Dupari splinter tribe of humans would lay the first stone blocks of what would become the Imaskar Empire. Founded as a magocracy renowned for its advanced magical knowledge, especially in planar and extra-dimensional magic, their wizard artificers and autocratic rule were marked by aggressive expansion, isolationist views, and most infamous, their enslavement of tens of thousands of human and humanoid races abducted from outside planes and worlds. From their capital and seat of power in Anupras resided the Palace of the Purple Emperor, where the Lord Artificer of Imaskar oversaw the Empire's control of vast territories, stretching from the Great Ice Sea to Karatur. Reinforcing the Imaskari isolationist ideology, manifesting as a distrust and disdain for any religious dogma, they erected planar walls to mute foreign gods, bred constructs to enforce silence, and generally basked in their own arrogance and oppression until the deities of those imprisoned would smash through the Imaskari gates. These enslaved people came to be collectively known as the Mulan. Despite the planar barriers and isolation, the Mulan prayers would eventually breach the Imaskari barriers. In -2489, celestial avatars descended upon the God's Watch peaks. Within a year, the Lord Artificer was slain, Imaskari jade towers had collapsed to ruin, and the Empire's great seat of power in Upras was leveled to rubble. The newly freed Mulan, guided by their manifest gods, trekked south along the shores of the Alambir River to carve new kingdoms from Imaskar's corpse. They would raise sandstone temples to their liberator gods such as Horus, and plant the seeds that would form the basis of the Malharandai and Untheric cultures of Faerûn. Beneath the fractured mantle of Imaskar, as the surface empire crumbled to dust, a splinter of its less-than-noble refugees who did survive the fall would retreat into the Underdark, founding the hidden city of Deep Imaskar in -2481 Dale Reckoning. And there it endures, a clandestine echo of hubris and ingenuity, quietly flourishing in exile, proof that in these realms few things truly perish. Old powers simply outwit the ruin, trading sunlight for secrecy, plotting their return in the depths. While the kingdoms of Imaskar dominated the east, another power was rising in the west. Calimshan's history begins in -7800 Dale Reckoning, founded by a large group of jinn who arrived from the elemental plane of air, along with their servants and slaves, settling the lands surrounding present-day Kalimport. Their kingdom would endure external threats from dragonflights and Marid water genies for nearly 2 millennia before the arrival of the Ifrit Memnon and his own legion of fire genies. This elemental rivalry of air and fire would rage across the region for 4 centuries in a conflict that history would later call the Era of Skyfire, the ceaseless destruction of the battles scorching the lands, creating the barren Kalim Desert. The I Dream of Genie wars would only end in -6100, when powerful elven high magic imprisoned both genie lords into a gem fittingly called the Calimemnon Crystal. For thousands of years, Calimshan's history was one of dynastic strife, wars with beholders from the Alamir Mountains, and long brutal conflicts against the dwarves of Shanatar. While the nation also endured internal strife, assassinations, and the deaths, or lichdom as the lore often suggests, of its powerful rulers, such as the infamous Kaiser Shun VII. With each hit, the Empire saw fractures in their central authority, slave revolts, city-state rivalries, and the resurging genie magic layering fresh turmoil atop old wounds. Despite the repeated devastation, however, Calimshan persisted, its cities rebuilt and its mercantile traditions proving as resilient as its people. Over time, the harshest elements faded, and Calimshan's cosmopolitan cities grew into crossroads of language, wealth, and culture. Today, Calimshan stands as a monument to that resilience, a nation that wears the scars of genie pride and centuries of endured threats, while its vibrant bazaars and robust trade prove that luxury, commerce, and secrets remain its heartbeat. Calimshan, eternal, ever changed, but never conquered. To the north of Calimshan, a different kind of power would emerge. In -5800, the 12 cities of Jhaamdath were founded, a confederation that is notable as Faerûn's first and only psiocracy. Ruled by psionic blade lords, Jhaamdath expanded its influence through mental might as much as steel. However, it was their xenophobia and aggression that would earn the scorn of the elves of the Condalwood. Their ruthless expansionism first leveling entire forests, followed by open slaughter of any elves who dared protest or oppose their careless progression. Desperate in the face of annihilation, the elves of the region turned to, you guessed it, elven high magic to rid themselves of their psionicist oppressors. And their call would be answered in -255 Dale Reckoning, as elven high mages called forth a colossal wave, and just like that, the 12 cities of Sword were wiped from the map, transforming Jhaamdath Bay into the Vilhan Reach. Those survivors who did not meet their watery grave that day would migrate to lands north and east of the Sea of Fallen Stars, including the unapproachable east, eventually settling in Thesk to found the kingdom of Impiltur, carrying on a fraction of Jhaamdath's legacy to this day. Of all the human empires that have spectacularly face-planted across Faerûn's history, none did it with more style and hubris than Netheril. It all began rather humbly in -3859 with the alliance of Seventon, a confederation of 7 human villages consisting mainly of fishermen and farmers located in North Faerûn, just south of the Narrow Sea, an ancient body of water you will not find on any modern maps of Faerûn, as the sea would transform in the centuries to come, becoming the frozen wastelands of the High Ice. However, these commoners would not remain backwater fishmongers and sustenance farmers for very long. The discovery of the Nether Scrolls, found amid the ruins of the ancient elven kingdoms of Aravandar only years later, would catapult the meager civilizations into an age of unparalleled arcane enlightenment. The neighboring elves of Erelon in the nearby Delambir Vale tried to play mentor, attempting to teach the Netherese proper discipline and restraint in using what were essentially universal cheat codes for arcane magic. The Netherese listened politely, then the Archmage Iolon promptly used the scroll's knowledge to haphazardly rip colossal chunks of rock from the planet in an early sign of things to come. The soon-to-be Netherese Archwizard would go on to create a mythalar that allowed the upstart civilization to lift and suspend entire cities into the air. The elves, predictably, were not pleased. Such rapid arcane advancement would soon see the skies cluttered with as many as 25 of these sky enclaves. From the great trade hub of Naloth to the inverted mountain peak of Sakors, each became the arcane real estate of the 1%. And it would be on one of these floating enclaves, the city of Eilenar, that a young wizard named Karsus stared at all the Netherese had achieved and thought to himself, yes, but what if one day I just broke everything? Soon, the burgeoning empire would see the formation of a stark class divide. The high Netheril magicratic nobility sipping enchanted wines in the clouds, while low Netheril was forced to dodge the falling refuse from above, landing on the decaying terrain below. You see, while the arch-wizards were busy with their supernatural-fueled gentrification, a cancer was growing beneath their soil. From the Underdark below, subterranean, powerful, arcane-empowered creatures called the Faerûn had insidiously begun draining the life from Netheril lands, slowly turning the fertile heartland into what would become the Anauroch Desert. The folks in Low Netheril noticed, but no one listened. The newly anointed wizard kings, drunk on their magical prowess, were too busy arguing over whose floating island had better curb appeal. The Empire's final, literal plummeting doom would arrive in -339, courtesy of the most infamous of these Netherese magi, a wannabe god wizard named Karsus. Not satisfied with the many blessings of fortune bestowed upon his people, Karsus would look upon the goddess of magic, one named Netheril in this age, and thought that he too was worthy of such divinity. So, in an act of grand arrogance that still makes sages and wizards cringe to this very day, Karsus would spend a decade of research to create a new spell of such complexity that the components alone would require nearly 10 years just to acquire. Although the original formula has never been found, just some of the required raw materials include the gizzard of a gold dragon, bile from a 12-headed hydra, and the blood of a Taras. The meticulous, decade-long craft would result in a spell of such power it required a ritual cast time of 6 hours. It was humbly called the Avatar of Karsus, and it was designed to steal the power of a god. There exist only slightly more charitable texts which take a more forgiving stance, suggesting Karsus may have thought the spell capable of granting him a new divinity of his choosing. However, most scholars agree that such a distinction would have mattered little in light of what history paints as perhaps the single most power-hungry human wizard in all of Realms lore. Regardless, the Archwizard would cast his self-titled spell, and for one terrifying moment, it actually worked. The problem? Karsus had the magical equivalent of a learner's permit and had just hot-wired a cosmic supercar. The weave that supports magic across all of Toril quickly began to unravel. Realizing the looming destruction, the goddess of magic quickly sacrificed herself to reboot a quickly distorting reality from blue screening. This selfless act overloaded the weave and broke the link to Karsus, destroying herself in the process to briefly stabilize the faltering weave, hitting the off switch for all of magic across the Forgotten Realms. The lights went out, the Mythalars failed, and what of those 25 sky cities of the rich and famous? They fell to the earth like, well, rocks. They fell like rocks. And in the absence of the magic that suspended them above, they did what all rocks on Toril do. They crashed like comets upon the earth below. That is, all but 4 of them. The fallout left the Netherese Empire in ruin, its legacy fragmented across Faerûn like shrapnel from a cosmic nuke. However, while most of High Netheril's floating nobility became a fine paste on the landscape below, the lore tells us the goddess of magic, now in her 2.0 form as Mystra, reincarnated in just enough time to catch 3 of the falling sky enclaves: Honoria, Osram, and Alondath. 3 of the 25 flying cities that had started their descent from the greatest heights. These surviving city-states flickered on for a few centuries more before meeting their own end from orc hordes, evil pacts, and the hostile desert. The 4th enclave, Tultanthar, was able to muster their fading magics to avoid their plummeting fate, shifting their city into the Plane of Shadow, where it would vanish for almost a millennia until making its return as the City of Shade in the 4th edition lore. As for the commoners of Low Netheril, those not crushed beneath the falling cities or its fallout scattered to the winds. Many would establish bloodlines with the many barbarian hordes of the region, namely among the savage peoples of the Angart, Rengarth, and Uthgart tribes. Still other refugees would flee west, becoming the founders of communities such as Ilusk, known today as Luskan. And finally, and most notably, we must mention the prescient wizards of Halrua. Having predicted such a disaster long ago, they had packed up and moved south long before this calamitous end, and were quick to tell any that would listen, "Hey, we told you so." In the aftermath of rubble and ruins, the reborn Mystra would implement new arcane safety regulations, starting with the banhammer on any spells above 9th level for mortals. That's right, the event history books would forever call Karsus' folly was so catastrophic, his actions caused a permaban on epic tier magic. So the next time you get frustrated that your 9th level fireball only did 14d6 damage, you can blame Karsus, the foolish wizard who thought himself a god. The Era of Upheaval is a fitting official name for this period of change lasting just over 120 years, stretching from 1358 into the 1480s. For many scholars and lore masters, however, this was an era of revision, so called for its generous use of some of the most historic changes seen across large swaths of Forgotten Realms history. The most devastating of the era's calamities would spring from a retcon storm of blue fire. But we must start the chronicles of this era 27 years before that infamous Spellplague would sweep across Faerûn. It was the Year of Shadows, 1358, better known as the Time of Troubles, a period when the divine rules of reality were bent and even gods found themselves vulnerable. The turmoil to follow officially started when the evil gods Bane and Merkel attempted to steal the Tablets of Fate, celestial artifacts believed to control the house rules of existence. Naturally, the overgod Eo was not amused. The result? A divine eviction from the pantheons of realms lore. Nearly all gods were cast down from their planes, forced to walk Toril in mortal avatar form. Clerics discovered that divine magic only worked if you were within shouting distance of your deity, and the arcane arts were about as predictable as a drunk wizard juggling fireballs. This was the Gods' War. Deities who were once abstract concepts of divine power were now getting into bar fights and being shanked in back alleys. Only Helm, god of vigilance and discipline, was exempt from this punishment, retaining his divine stature to stand sentinel at the gates of the heavens, barring entry until the Tablets of Fate were restored. The first victim of this punishment was Mystra, because of course it was. Desperate to return to the heavens and restore order, she tried to bypass the Overgod's mandate by ascending the celestial stairway without permission. Helm, bound by duty and decree, stood in her way. Mystra insisted, then resisted, but the goddess of magic in her greatly diminished avatar form was no match for Helm as the only deity to retain his full power. Mystra died instantly. By the way, that's number 2 if you're counting. Her death unleashed a torrent of arcane instability, only the first omen of the coming disasters. It would be the action of mortal heroes, some eventually granted their own godhood, who would retrieve the stolen Tablets of Fate. However, in a plot twist worthy of a David Fincher film, the Overgod destroyed the recovered tablets, untethering the realms from the rules that had once governed divinity, fate, and the world itself. With cosmic law unraveled and gods in mortal avatar forms dropping like flies, their domain portfolios became twisted or fading out altogether. The dead 3 of Baal, Bane, and Merkel in particular would each fall during this era. Baal, god of murder, was ironically murdered himself by the sword god's Bane at the hands of a mortal named Cyric. Baal is said to have foreseen his death, leaving behind a legacy of his mortal children known as the Baalspawn. Their stories are most notably recounted in the Baldur's Gate saga of novels and video games. The god of tyranny Bane and Torm, the god of duty, would kill each other in battle, while Merkel fell to the mortal wizard Midnight on the water-deep rooftops of Blackstaff Tower. When the dust finally settled, a handful of mortals scored themselves their own deific upgrades, among them the wizard Midnight, ascending to become Mystra, 3.0 if you're keeping score at home, as well as the quite insane mercenary Cyric, his divine appointment reflecting in the light of chaos to come, seeming about as wise as electing a pyromaniac to run a scroll shop. As the Time of Troubles came to a close, the gods were allowed to claw their way back to their thrones. However, the chaos was just warming up. The true shattering of realms lore would come in the form of that mighty storm of blue fire. Let's make one thing clear. There is no archdevil, demon lord, or elder evil across the multiverse that has ever managed to kill as many gods or erase as many lands and their people as the 4th edition's rewriting of realms lore, delivered in a historical disaster that would forever be called the Spellplague. With divinity restored to a pantheon of gods who seem to learn nothing from their Gods' War punishment, the 4th edition specific lore of the Spellplague would tell us the calamity was ignited through the collusion of Cyric, always a willing vessel for chaos and now holding the status of a deity, and the Dark Lady of Loss, Shar. Manipulated by the Nightbringer Shar in 1385, Cyric the Mad God would murder who else but, say it with me, Mystra. And that makes 3. The death of the goddess of magic once again disrupted the weave. However, unlike the demise of her previous incarnations, this time the foundation of magic didn't just bend, it broke. The Spellplague, a dimension-warping hurricane of raw, blue, chaotic energy, was unleashed, and the fallout was apocalyptic. With the Tablets of Fate now broken, the distinct realities of Abir and Toril, separated over 32 millennia ago, began to blur as walls of surreal azure flame scoured land and sea, mutating everything it touched. I am barely scratching the surface of the many impacts of and scars left by the Spellplague, an event that I have well chronicled in a separate video called The 10 Sins of the Spellplague that you can check out in the links below. Regardless, in the Spellplague's aftermath, a residual plague would infect the realm for the next decade. They were called the Wailing or Plague Years, and they would be marked by a series of widespread transformations not seen since the planet's formation. The world's landscape was reshaped as entire regions, their empires, their people, even their gods, were destroyed, mutated, displaced, or simply vanished. The casualties were numerous. In the west, the remote island nation of Nimbral, known by sailors as the Sea Haven and the Land of Summer Seas, simply disappeared. Across the trackless sea to the west, the entire subcontinent of Mastika was ripped from the realms, Sid transported to Abir, its absence marked by the sudden arrival of the unfamiliar continent of Larrakond. Elsewhere, Chult was transformed from a peninsula into an island, forcibly isolated from the mainland as the terrain reshaped overnight. The eastern lands fared no better. The vast plain of the Shar collapsed in on itself, creating the Underchasm linking the surface world directly to the Underdark. The ancient empires of Aglarond, Unthar, Mulhorand, and Kondath saw the Spellplague destruction at their borders firsthand, with Mulhorand and Unthar vanishing almost entirely from Toril, their people scattered or lost. Halrua, a once mighty nation of archwizards, was nearly obliterated as they attempted to transport the nation elsewhere, but the devastation was near total, and Halrua disappeared from the realms. Lurin, the halfling homeland of the Shining South, drowned under the floods of an expanded Great Sea. Even the elven refuge of Evermeet was not immune to the blue storm of Retcon, as portions of the island shifted into the Feywild, becoming unreachable to most mortals. The Spellplague did not discriminate in its destruction or its caprice, and in its aftermath, Faerûn was a world fundamentally changed. For the next century, scholars and cartographers grappled with a realm map that closer resembled a child's drawing than any historical record. And it would be in 1482 Dale Reckoning that the overgod Ao, reflecting on the erosion of normalcy caused by the 4th edition Spellplague, would then decide to step in and try to undo or repair at least some of the damage and residual scars left by the lore-rebooting Blue Storm. This attempt at a divine do-over would be called the Second Sundering and was only partially successful. Having destroyed the original Tablets of Fate during the Time of Troubles, an act intended to teach the gods humility but undeniably creating more chaos than order, Ao finally recognized that his dramatic gesture had fundamentally weakened the cosmological and natural laws of realm space. The destruction of the celestial bylaws had allowed the twin worlds of Abir and Toril, separated since primordial times, to slowly overlap and merge. Ao's solution was characteristically direct. Recreate the Tablets of Fate entirely, inscribe new divine portfolios and limitations upon them, and forcibly separate Abir and Toril once more. Yet, what makes this cosmic reset particularly fascinating and also quite maddening is its connection to events spanning the deepest reaches of Realm's lore history. The Second Sundering appearing to present as not only the correction but a culmination of temporal echoes that rippled both backward and forward through the timelines of history. The most perplexing connection lies with the always confusing First Sundering, occurring circa -17,600. During that chronicled high magic ritual, this theory posits that the immense power brought forth not only created the island sanctuary of Evermeet, but literally bent time in the process, a rare feat that sent chronological shockwaves throughout the historic timeline. According to recovered text, an elven seer named Eliandrith of Orishar was present during this ritual, and in the throes of such temporal displacement, witnessed not only his own time's fracture, but also two other, quote, sunderings, one in the distant past and another in the far future. In what can only be described as prophetic, Eliandrith dubbed these visions the Tearfall, and the very event we are discussing now, the Second Sundering. These documented writings go on to suggest that the elven ritual of -17,600 created a temporal resonance connecting all three events. The Second Sundering's most dramatic manifestations, able to bear witness to mortal eyes, were the reversal of the Spellplague's geographic devastation. The Sea of Fallen Stars returned to its pre-Spellplague volume through a phenomenon known as the Great Rain. The Underchasm, a massive fragment of the planet that had connected the surface directly to the Underdark, was filled in completely, restoring the land known as the Shar to something resembling its former state. Most remarkable was the reappearance of entire nations that had disappeared during the Spellplague. Lantern and Nimbril, both island nations that had vanished entirely, reappeared, with fantastic tales of ships from Nimbril arriving at ports across the Sword Coast in 1483, their crews neither aged nor aware they had been missing from the world for nearly a century. Untha returned as well, though in a more diminished form and unable to reclaim all its former territories. And the waters partially receded from Lorien, making the halfling homeland accessible again. Even more mysteriously, Evermeet was also restored to Toril, but in a state that defies conventional understanding of planar boundaries, with the elven islands simultaneously touching Toril, the Feywild, and Arvindor, seemingly existing across all three planes at once. The Faerunian pantheon underwent equally dramatic changes during the Second Sundering, with what can only be described as a mass resurrection of previously dead or missing deities. The most significant of these divine restorations was that of Mystra, marking her third death and fourth rebirth. Meanwhile, the dead three, Bane, Baal, and Merkel, were resurrected, but found themselves greatly reduced in power as demigod divine mortals. This suggests that, at least for some, divine resurrection came with new terms of service under Ao's divine mandate. Perhaps the aspect of the Second Sundering found both most amusing and perhaps infuriating, at least from an academic perspective, was the quiet correction of cosmological models that had emerged during the century of upheaval, if these frameworks ever even changed at all. Sages studying the post-Sundering cosmos came to the conclusion that the Great Wheel cosmology was the proper model of the planes, dismissing alternative theories as the work of the lunatic fringe. The world access model, as well as concepts such as the astral sea, were relegated to the status of interesting but fundamentally flawed academic exercises. As we arrive at present-day Dale Reckoning to look back, our attempt to reconcile these ages and their events feels rather like documenting a fever dream. Coherent in the moment, bewildering in retrospect, and more often than we'd like, contradicted by later events that claim to have always been true in the first place. Yet perhaps that's poetically fitting for a world where the fundamental laws of reality are subject to divine revision, where an overgod can quite literally rewrite the rules when previous decisions prove inconvenient, and where the very nature of causality seems, well, negotiable. As we close out this epic series covering over 36,000 years of timelines, discoveries, and realm-shaping events, perhaps the most fitting perspective comes from one who knows intimately the cost of divine ambition. During his trial for the murder of Mystra, the mad god Cyric once declared, quote, "If I can destroy the love of gods, then I can certainly fill the lives of Faerun's mortals with strife and discord." How prophetic those words proved to be, for in the end, the greatest threats to the realms never came from villains, dragons, or the evils of undeath, but from those who would and could remake reality according to their own distorted visions, whether they wore a crown of a god or simply dreamed of doing so. If you made it this far without casting astral projection, then congratulations. You now know more about Faerun's history than 91% of actual Forgotten Realms NPCs. But before we plane shift out, massive thanks to the legendary lore masters who make this whole operation possible, my channel members and Patreon supporters. These deep dives take hundreds of hours to produce, so if you enjoyed the ride, subscribe and hit that like button like it owes you gold. And if you want to ensure more content like this, then hype the video up in the comments. For access to HDR packs across all my lore videos, as well as world-building resources, maybe check out my Patreon. Links are below. Thanks for watching or listening. Let's do it again real soon. Until then, take care, my friends.